Lecture 14, The Gifts of the Spirit. Let us begin with a reading from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. The moral life of Christians is sustained by the gifts of the Holy Spirit. These are permanent dispositions which make man docile in following the promptings of the Holy Spirit. Well, yet another important focus of spiritual direction is life in the Spirit. We have seen that the life of the virtues lead us into the good. Virtues, by definition, are acquired or infused dispositions which enable us to do good or avoid evil. They are acquired through training and practice, such as in the natural virtues of prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. And they are infused through grace, especially in the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. And as this grace infuses those natural cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance to lift them up and transform them so that we may become divinized. Well, the gifts of the Holy Spirit, in a certain sense, perfect the life of the virtue. If I can draw a distinction, when we are acting under the influence of infused virtues, these are virtues under the influence of God's grace, we are still the primary actors. We are still the primary people who are acting to do good or to avoid evil. But the gifts of the Spirit, they too are infused dispositions of the soul, and they too come from God. But when we are influenced and acting under the gifts of the Holy Spirit and are responding to the promptings of the Spirit, it is the Spirit who becomes the primary actor. As Paul himself says, it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me, the Spirit of Christ living in the human person. We speak of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. Well, when the Spirit indwells in us, and when we have removed enough detachment in our lives from earthly things, that we are in touch with the Spirit, we are able to respond to its promptings, and the Spirit is the one who moves us. This is intimacy with God. What are the gifts of the Holy Spirit? Well, there are 7 of them, and they are strong dispositions of being and action given to us by God at baptism and strengthened in baptism. And the 7 are these: wisdom, understanding, counsel, knowledge, fortitude, piety, and fear of the Lord. And it is said that the theology of the gifts has its roots in the patristic reflections on Isaiah 11, 1-2, which modern exegetes generally agree is a prophetic description of the qualities of a virtuous king. Let me read these 2 verses to you. From Isaiah: "The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, and the spirit of wisdom and understanding, the spirit of counsel and might, the spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And his delight shall be the fear of the Lord." Well, because of Christ, we all have a royal calling. We are all princes. Because of the indwelling of the Spirit in our lives, we have received the gifts of the Spirit. However, there's a difference between receiving a gift and using a gift. Have you ever heard of a person who receives a gift and never opens the package, who never sees what it is, who never opens it up and uses it for what it was meant to be, often it happens that we refuse to use the gifts of the Spirit, even though they have been given to us at baptism. We need to be able to cooperate with God's grace. That all begins with prayer, the great means of salvation. It means with asking God that we may walk along the way of virtue through acquired virtue, or those natural virtues, or the infused virtues which enable us to focus our lives entirely on God. But we need to use these gifts. Well, I'd like to look at these 7 gifts from the perspective of how they function in the human person, in the human soul. And first there are the gifts of intellect, wisdom, understanding, counsel, and knowledge. Let me say a little bit about each of these. The gift of wisdom, which is associated with the virtue of charity. Now, interestingly enough, charity is a virtue of the will. But when we are united with God's will, so much so that we become one with him, we have a certain connatural knowledge of him. And that knowledge is the knowledge known as wisdom. It's knowing about God, not conceptually, but knowing him as a friend. The gift of wisdom enables us to make correct judgments about divine things. It steeps us in the way of truth and tells us when we are in danger of departing from it. And in spiritual direction, wisdom comes to the fore whenever directors encourage those seeking guidance to ponder those they love, God, family, friends, and consider what truths they have learned from them. Now, the gift of understanding is associated with the virtue of faith, and it is an interior light imparted to us by God that enables us to go beyond the limitations of our natural powers of reason and come to a deep knowledge of the mysteries of the faith. This gift presupposes the ongoing presence of faith in our lives. Without faith, there can be no understanding. And in spiritual direction, understanding is at work whenever we ask those seeking for a fuller explanation of something that has not been shared. The gift of counsel is associated with the virtue of prudence. It enables us to examine our options for action and to make prudent decisions under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. It complements the virtue of prudence, which either acquired or inspired by grace relies solely on the working of practical reason for its conclusions. And in spiritual direction, counsel is operative whenever we encourage those seeking guidance to make sound practical judgments about Christian living. The gift of knowledge is associated also with the virtue of faith, and it helps us to make proper judgments about the meaning and content of our beliefs. In spiritual direction, knowledge is present whenever we encourage those seeking guidance to handle worldly things in a godly way. Now, in addition to these gifts of the intellect, there are also gifts of the will and affection, fortitude, piety, and fear of the Lord. The gift of fortitude is associated with the virtue of fortitude. It enables us to pursue any task to its end without fear of loss or failure. It gives us both an assurance that no danger or peril will separate us from the love of God, and a confidence of ultimate victory in the face of insurmountable odds. When we are responding through the gift of fortitude, it is no longer us acting, but it is the Spirit acting in us. And in direction, fortitude shows itself whenever we encourage those seeking guidance to deal with the obstacles preventing them from living authentic Christian lives. The gift of piety is associated with the virtue of justice. It strengthens our affections and moves us to honor and serve God out of a deep sense of filial devotion. Through this gift, the Spirit helps us to recognize that we are adopted sons and daughters of God and calls us to act accordingly. Justice is to give everyone what is due to them. The gift of piety is associated with justice because it asks us to give to God what is due to God. And in direction, piety comes to the fore whenever we help those seeking guidance to deepen their reverence for God and manifest it sincerely and authentically in the concrete circumstances of their lives. And the gift of fear of the Lord is associated with the virtue of temperance. It fills us with a deep awe and reverence for God. Through it, we recognize our smallness, our creatureliness before our Creator, and become afraid that we may withdraw ourselves from His love. And it is associated with temperance because it then enables us, out of fear of hurting God, it enables us to live moderately and not to turn to excesses. And in direction, fear of the Lord is at play whenever we help those seeking guidance to see their smallness before God and their insignificance in the vast scheme of things. Now, these descriptions help us understand the meaning of the gifts of the Spirit and how they operate in our lives. Spiritual direction does not give us the gifts of the Spirit, but it can be an instrument which helps us to go to a deeper level of awareness, to understanding that they give us this deeper understanding and awareness of the movement of the Spirit in our lives and what it means to respond to its holy promptings. It's all about being led by the Spirit. It's being led by the Spirit as in a divine dance, allowing the Spirit to move us and lead us through life from one moment to the next. It's a spontaneous way of responding to God. Virtue and the gifts of the Spirit are meant to make a second nature out of us. Christ living in us, moving us, not taking possession of us, because He still allows us to be ourselves, our minds to be our own minds, our wills to be our own wills. But we are so in union with God that we are able to follow Him as a close friend. To be led by the Spirit. Beneath all of this is the life of prayer. Prayer is the air we breathe that enables us to live a life of the Spirit. To draw close to God in prayer means that we are responding to the movement of grace in our lives, and we are open to the promptings of the Spirit. And so let me summarize what these 7 gifts of the Spirit do. Wisdom enables us to make sound judgments about the things of God. Understanding helps us to grasp more fully what we believe. Knowledge does the same regarding the things of the earth. Counsel helps us to discern the right course of action. Fortitude gives us confidence in the Lord in the midst of adversity. Piety fills us with a sense of reverence for God, and fear of the Lord gives us a sense of dread at the possibility of offending Him. Taken together, these gifts assure the believer of God's concrete presence and action in the face of every possible challenge. They are the winds that blow the sails of our souls and enable us to navigate our way through the difficult waters of life. Without them, none of us would make very much headway in the spiritual life. Spiritual direction teaches us how to sense these winds and put them to good use. When talking about their presence in the life of believers, it is important to think of the gifts as working in harmony and as having a certain synergetic effect on us. Of course, there's much more that can be said about the gifts of the Spirit. For this very reason, a second pair of eyes, those of a good director, can help us to appreciate them as vital aids given to us by God for our own spiritual health and well-being of the entire Christian community. When these qualities exist in our lives, it is probably because we have been open to the promptings of the Spirit and have made good use of the gifts, perhaps without ever being aware of it. And so let us close with some reflection questions. What are the gifts of the Spirit? How do the gifts differ from the virtues? Which gifts are associated with the intellect? Which gifts are associated with the will and affections? What does it mean to be led by the Spirit?